I love this home retreat idea. Where's my team? I'm like, that's a good idea. I'm also excited about the chai. I wish I'd be in town for some good chai. Made me think of how in India, first time I went there, I was in college, and it was all so new to me. And in the train, I heard people coming through, flies. And I was like, oh my gosh, they're putting flies in the cups, and they're giving no, it was chai. Chai. I thought there were flies. So I had planned ahead for today's session. Not that I actually plan ahead much, but I had at least come up with a title for today, which was about conscious intentions, resolutions. And last night, in sitting with it, I decided it was that I would touch on that because some of you may have actually come here because I said that's what I was going to talk about. I'm also kind of hoping that there might be some people in the room that are like, I don't know what she's going to talk about, but this is just where I go on the weekend. And because I do feel, I felt compelled to shift my focus a bit just based on what's going on in the world. So I pulled an excerpt of my book last night that will touch a little more directly where we are in this moment in time. And if I'm as good as Dan at just kind of weaving things together, perhaps I'll also be able to weave in something about this title I had originally chosen. We'll see. No pressure. So I wanted to begin by focusing a bit on the role of judgment and shame in the midst of where we are. This section begins with the heading, The Inner Critic as Clouds. My first Zen teacher used to say that true spiritual practice can't begin until self-hate ends. My experience is not so linear. Yes, it can be helpful to name some basic steps of practice, which I had actually done at a different section of the book. So this is kind of a bit of a review, because these steps can be viewed in a linear fashion. So in our workshop yesterday, we touched on these, but I wanted to share them again in light of what's going on in our world. So when we watch ourselves moving to judgment, hatred, anger, rage, upset, confusion, these steps I have found can be supports for coming back to a place of center with what is. I want to acknowledge I'm going to read the steps the way it's written in my book, and then I'll tell you an even simpler way to remember them. So step 1, see it. Recognize that the voice of the inner critic exists. Step 2, name it. Cultivate the capacity to say, there's the voice of the inner critic again. Step 3, let go. Further inquiry into the illusory nature of this voice, to disidentify and to release the grip. And then step 4, return. Align with awareness of the voice rather than the voice itself. So return to presence. So that's the way it was written in my book. And y'all, I've been teaching those steps since I was a monastic. And I've found that it's so supportive for folks to just have a linear process for disidentifying from the conditioned mind. As I mentioned in the meditation, conditioned mind, the mind of limitation, the mind of habit, the mind that's been shaped by society, culture, friends, what else? family, past traumas. Okay. So I've been teaching this, and then at Peace in Schools, I mentioned the nonprofit that started in Portland. Peace in Schools, I've worked intimately with someone named Maggie Steele for over a decade. And one day she said to me, we really need to be sharing these steps with the teens in our curriculum. But the way you teach it is way too hard to remember. So I think we need to just call it SNAP. And I had never figured out how to make an acronym out of this, but she was right that you could. So it's see it, name it. We cheated. It's not, you can't, how can you work with L right there, y'all? But she made a great point. She was like, so many people struggle with the prompt, let it go. Like, how do I let it go? What does that even mean? I have to effort to let something go. I'm not good at letting go. Now I'm just beating myself up. This is supposed to be about a practice to help me disidentify from the inner critic. But now I'm just beating myself up because I can't let go. Okay. So she was like, how about allow? If we accept, that creates space for letting go. So allow, accept, whichever A you want there. And then the return, we cheated again. It's return to presence. So for SNAP. So if that's useful to you during this time, I wanted to share it with you. See it, name it, allow, return to presence. We have enough examples of what it's like to react to what is in our world right now from a place that isn't centered. We have enough reactivity. What does it mean to meet these times from a place of allowing, accepting, from a place of presence? So, having taught this process to now teens and adults for over 20 years, I've come to recognize that this ongoing practice is shaped more like a spiral than a line. If we cling to the idea that we have to get rid of self-hate before we can get to the real practice, quote unquote, then we're feeding the distortion that there's a self who needs to get rid of something in order to get somewhere else. This keeps in place not only a limited belief in a separate self, but also a linear view of time. It's difficult to ask ourselves foundational practice questions like, who am I truly? If we're mired in conversations about worthiness. And we must be careful not to give too much validity, to attribute too much reality to a hologram. And by hologram, I mean the illusion of a self that's separate from life. So we have to be careful not to give it a certain reality. Otherwise, our practices can easily slide into self-improvement. The reason self-improvement ultimately doesn't work is that in reality, there is no separate self to improve. It's not my experience that through practice, negative self-talk, the voice of the inner critic disappears forever. To believe so gives this illusory voice in our heads a solidity it doesn't actually have. It's my experience that through practice, we become more and more clear about what this voice is, and therefore, we tend to fall for its shenanigans less and less frequently. It's not to say it doesn't arise again. We can think of the workings of the inner critic as storm clouds. We could say that over time and with practice, we believe less and less that every time the cloud rolls through, the sun has disappeared. We can absolutely focus on the recognition that not only does the sun not disappear, but that we are the steady sun while the clouds do whatever the clouds do. They're transitory, impermanent. We are undisturbed. There's plenty of room for any and all weather patterns in the truth of reality. The reality is that we are not the weather patterns. The reality is that the weather patterns arise in us, pass through us, dissolve in us. There's plenty of room for storms to do whatever storms do. To have them move in whatever way they're going to move while we inquire. So who am I? I'm not these weather patterns. I'm not this negative self-talk. I'm not these emotions. Who are we? What is, quote unquote, us? What is that fundamentally? It's liberating to realize that we don't have to get rid of anything to know who we truly are, to know the heart of who we truly are. When we're identified with negative self-talk, the ego, which I talk about as the activity of the conditioned mind. Again, I don't refer to the ego as if it's a real thing. It's a hologram of sorts. It's the activity of the conditioned mind. But if we're identified with negative self-talk, the ego gets legitimized. It gets fed. Something that I discussed in chapter 1 of the book is that where we place our attention matters. So what we feed grows. The feeding process doesn't make the ego more real, but rather more believable. Practice supports us in challenging our conditioned beliefs. And in this challenge, what isn't true dissolves. Believing negative self-talk keeps us feeling alone, busy, fearful. That we are separate isn't true. The more we believe the voice of, let's say, I'm not good enough, the more likely we are to feel isolated. That we need to get rid of the ego in order to be free, that there's something wrong with having an ego in the first place, isn't true. The more we feed this narrative, the more likely we are to continually strive in our practices. Whatever you do isn't enough. That belief isn't true. But when we believe this, we're afraid, unable, or resistant to rest in the satisfaction of what's here now. I want to skip to another section in this, but still in this theme, in the same chapter from The Heart of Who We Are. This section is called From the Personal to the Collective. So when we step back from the workings of the inner critic and its cycles of negative self-talk, we see the workings simply as processes of suffering. We have greater clarity about how these processes normalize the absurd. There's a certain absurdity in believing that we are isolated while living in such a deeply interconnected world. There's a certain absurdity to a child having to question their worth based on believing in an illusory voice without a body, that negative self-talk. On a personal level, we're conditioned to normalize the absurd. You all with me on that? Can you see what it means in your own life to normalize the absurd? Like, it's absurd that we're walking around following the guidance of a disembodied voice inside our head, but it's normalized. Like, we're referencing the conditioned mind, assuming that that's going to give us some kind of clarity about how to proceed in our lives. But the conditioned mind is completely shaped by all the things that we named, including traumas. So intellectually, we might say, well, I don't want to move through the world just acting on behalf of my trauma for the rest of my life. And yet that's easier said than done, right? So on a personal level, we're conditioned to normalize the absurd, and that's true collectively too. One of the reasons I wrote this book is because I was interested in how often in practice settings we're bringing attention to how to get more free personally. And I was very struck by how often in my own monastic setting, where, as Dan mentioned, I was there for years, we rarely talked about the collective. How are we getting more free collectively? How are we seeing through collective delusion? So we've been conditioned, I'll just give an example of collective distortion. We've been conditioned to perceive, quote unquote, the other. We've been conditioned to perceive hierarchy. Hierarchies are made up and mythologized, such as hierarchies of race, a made-up concept, and the hierarchy of class. We've been conditioned to avoid seeing how these things came to be, to maintain the status quo, to not question. We have a collective ego. So we talk about the personal ego all the time in practice, right? We have a collective ego. We have a collective inner critic. Neither have reality without the ways our collective attention feeds them. So can you feel how the activity of your own conditioned mind is fed through your attention, and then that's what gives it a particular reality? So we're doing the same thing collectively. We're collectively reinforcing, for example, this notion of hierarchies. And we don't have to look far to see the fallout of our distortion, our distorted view. For some time now, I've been paying attention to how we collectively normalize the absurd. This is a phrase I first heard from Michelle Cassandra Johnson, who I've worked with. As social and political turmoil has been reaching a fever pitch as I write the book, nothing has shifted. This book came out a couple years ago. Nothing, here we are, right? I find examples of this phenomenon everywhere. So many circumstances wildly unreasonable, yet normalized. There's a particular absurdity to the way in which, within dominant culture, our expanding homeless population is normalized, or the prevalence of gun violence, or the way that Black mothers are more likely to die during childbirth than white mothers, or the rapidly increasing rate of species extinction. So pause. Fill in the blanks for what's true today. Again, I wrote this years ago. And just check in right now with what's happening in your body. Even as we bring these things into our Dharma practice, what's here now with it? Just watch for any temptation to say, I don't want to be with this. Because we're privileged, we have the opportunity to be with what is in beloved community, with support, knowing that our intention is to see through delusion, to see the reality of what is, beyond the distortion, beyond the conditioned hierarchy, beyond the harm. So in the book I wrote, watch for any temptation to skim through those sentences. This is part of the conditioned normalization process, to read without feeling, or to go numb, or to absorb information as if we aren't affected. Or perhaps we're part of a collective that is conditioned to see these things as someone else's problem. Read the above paragraph again, and this time pay close attention to what happens in your body, mind, and energetic system as you do so. Our shared processes of avoiding feeling do nothing to dismantle our collective conditioning. So for now, I want to focus on judgment and how it plays a role in this. Judgment collectively keeps much of the machinery of the conditioned cycles that normalize the absurd in place. In other words, the collective inner critic acts like a glue for our collective conditioning. Just for example, the collective belief that poor people are only poor because they don't work hard enough and thereby deserve our collective judgment. This judgment keeps a collective those people, quote unquote, in place, this conditioned lens of separation. It acts as a glue to keep the collective conditioning intact in the same way that judgment acts as a glue to keep personal conditioning intact. Judgment poisons the heart. The pain of shame prevents clear seeing. And lack of clear seeing prevents change. So I want to invite you to pause again and notice what's here now. Just popcorn style. We don't need to pass the mic. You can write in the chat just 1, 2, or 3 words, what's here now. Let's just popcorn style. Just say what's alive, what's here now, and I'll repeat it back so people in Zoom can hear. Maybe you can raise your hand since we're a big enough group that it could get chaotic if we all just speak at once. What's here now? Yes. Heaviness. Grief. Confusion. Fear. Regret. Contraction. Compassion. Tears, fear, and a tight throat. Disappointment. Overwhelm. And a few online. I will do my best to anger. Okay, great. Thank you. That's helpful. Great. So take a moment, friends, to close your eyes and let yourself touch the heart of awareness that has infinite room for everything that was just named. And not as a way to bypass anything that's here in this room, but as a way to truly be with what's here. Recognize that you are not what's arising. So instead of saying, I am grief, recognize this grief as arising in the vastness of me. Feel yourself as the vastness that naturally holds what is. Take this moment together in beloved community to recognize you don't have to try to accept what is. So much of what's happening is not acceptable. And spiritual practice doesn't mean we can't take a stand to say, this is not acceptable. In fact, may our spiritual practices fuel our sacred duty to speak up when there's a breach in the recognition of shared being. But let yourself feel now that before we can respond to our sacred duty, we have to be able to say, yes, this is that level of acceptance. Yes, this is. Awareness naturally does this. You don't have to become someone who's striving in your spiritual practice to do it. Awareness naturally says, yes, this is. Even great delusion, great distortion, great harm, yes, this is. So in this moment, see whatever's arising, name it. As you just did in this room, grief, confusion, upset, terror, sorrow, overwhelm. Name it. You're naming it from awareness. If you were not aware, you couldn't name it. And then allow. Again, you don't have to try to allow. You don't have to become an identity. You don't have to identify with the illusion of a separate self that's trying to allow. Awareness naturally allows. It doesn't mean it says, I like this, or I normalize the absurd. It means allow. And then in this moment, return to presence. Let yourself feel held in presence in this moment by presence. And then most importantly, as presence. Feel yourself, know yourself as presence. Feel yourself and know yourself as awareness itself. Naturally, with whatever is. Again, not out of trying or striving, but because that's the very nature of awareness. The unity of being. If any part of you is arising that's saying, but no, I don't want this. I want to focus on how I don't want this. That's fine. Notice that awareness is undisturbed by any part of you that arises. Your being is untarnished by whatever arises. Give yourself permission to return the attention to being. Not as a way of bypassing what is, but as a way of remembering that you naturally can be with what is. It doesn't take effort, discipline, striving. It is your nature. Thank you. I wanted to close with just a few things about this topic that I had said I was going to talk about, and that's the difference between conscious intention and New Year's resolution. So I'll just say how that relates to this. When we're identified with the conditioned mind, when we're feeling as though we have to strive in order to accept, for example, just to tie it in, we feel like we need resolutions to keep us in track, and resolutions become something that we feel or are going to we're going to improve our practice and we're going to improve ourselves. But conscious intentions, this is what we were focusing on our workshop yesterday. Conscious intentions are a way to say, as I mentioned in the workshop yesterday, that Seneca said something to the effect of, if we don't know the port for which we're steering, no wind is favorable to us. So conscious intentions are a way to say, where is this boat heading? How do I want to be with what is in such a way that I can be clear about where I would like this boat to go? Just because there's no separate self doesn't mean we can't align our will with awareness itself. I chose to come down to Oregon to be with you all and then be with the Peace in Schools educators this next week. That was a choice, right? Choosing where we place our attention versus being governed by whatever is happening in the conditioned mind. It is a choice. So we can have conscious intention and choose to realign the attention with who we really are versus who we've been conditioned to be. And we can do that personally. And as you're hearing what I'm lit up by in these times in particulars, we can do that collectively. And I truly believe it's up to us to figure out what that looks like. So again, thank you.